"You should have kept your mouth shut." The voice was a ghost in the wind, a cruel memory that clung to her like the cold. Blood, a stark, impossible crimson, blossomed on the pristine canvas of the snow where she lay. The world was a haze of white pain, the sky a sheet of unforgiving granite. He had left her here, in the heart of a Wyoming winter, with nothing but the promise of a slow, freezing death. Her black duster, usually a symbol of her formidable presence, was now just a tattered shroud against the biting cold. Consciousness was a slippery thing, a fish writhing in her grasp, and she was losing her grip. The heavy weight of her Colt felt distant, useless against the crushing power of the wilderness. A final, ragged breath escaped her lips, misting in the frigid air before vanishing. This, she thought with a strange, detached calm, was the end of the road. But then, through the snow-laden pines, a shape emerged. A man on a sturdy horse, his silhouette broad and dark against the blinding white. He moved with a quiet purpose, his gaze scanning the fence line that marked the edge of his world. This was Reese, a man who had deliberately carved a life from solitude, whose only conversations were with the wind and the mountains that stood silent, eternal sentinels over his valley. He saw the stain first, a disruption in the perfect, lonely landscape he knew so well. Then he saw her, a heap of black wool and dark hair, so still he thought she was already gone. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the deep powder, his heart a heavy drum against his ribs. Bringing trouble home was the last thing he ever wanted. His life was quiet, ordered, and safe. This woman, even from a distance, radiated danger. But the faint puff of mist from her lips, the barest sign of life, erased all his hesitation. His conscience was an older, stronger force than his fear. He knelt, his movements careful, and gently turned her over. Her face was a brutal tapestry of cuts and bruises, yet beneath the violence there was a strength in the line of her jaw, a fierce beauty that the cold could not extinguish. He scooped her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt. Her body was a block of ice, her life a flickering ember he had to shield against the storm. As he carried her back to his horse, he looked up at the mountains, their peaks shrouded in gray clouds. He had invited the storm into his home. He carried her across the threshold of his cabin as the first heavy flakes of a new blizzard began to fall, a curtain of white descending to isolate them completely from the world. The small, sturdy structure was a sanctuary of warmth and the scent of pine smoke. A stone hearth dominated one wall, its fire a living, breathing creature of orange and gold. This was Reese's entire world, built with his own hands, a fortress against the ghosts of his past. He laid her gently on the cot near the fire, her stillness a stark contrast to the crackling flames. For a long moment he just stood there, looking at the woman who had fallen into his life from a violent sky. Her clothes were frozen stiff, her skin deathly pale beneath the ugly purpled bruises. He worked with a practiced, gentle efficiency that belied his large frame. He cut away the frozen layers of her black shirt and trousers, his touch hesitant, respectful. He cleaned the cuts on her face with a soft cloth dipped in warm water and a tincture of herbs Martha, the old woman from the next valley, had taught him to make. He worked in silence, his mind a quiet turmoil. Every instinct screamed at him to stay away. She was an outlaw. The fine leather of her gun belt and the expertly maintained pistol holstered within it told him that much. She was trouble, the kind that came with bullets and blood. Yet as he tended to her, a different instinct took hold, a deep, protective urge he thought had died years ago with his wife and child. He saw not an outlaw, but a woman broken and discarded. He saw the line of pain etched between her brows, the vulnerability in the slight curl of her fingers. He wrapped her in his thickest wool blankets and sat by the fire, watching her, listening to the rhythm of her shallow breathing against the howling of the wind outside. Hours passed. The blizzard raged, sealing them in. Just as dusk painted the windows in shades of deep blue and violet, her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a wild, cornered fear. Her gaze darted around the unfamiliar room before landing on him. Her hand instinctively went for the gun that wasn't there. "Where?" she rascaled, her voice a dry whisper. "You're safe," Reese said, his voice low and calm, trying not to spook her. "You're in my home. You're freezing to death out there." Her eyes narrowed, searching his face for deceit, for the threat that was her constant companion. She saw only a quiet weariness, a deep-seated sadness, and an honesty that was as stark and real as the mountains outside his window. In the days that followed, a fragile truce settled within the cabin's warm walls. Lynn, as he learned her name was, remained coiled and watchful, a predator forced into stillness but not tamed. She rarely spoke, offering only clipped, necessary words. He did not press her. He understood the language of silence, the need for space around a wound. He would leave a bowl of hot broth on the small table beside her cot, then retreat to the other side of the room to mend a harness or sharpen a tool, the simple, rhythmic tasks a comfort to them both. He gave her the privacy of his own silence, a gift she seemed to recognize and appreciate. He watched her from the corner of his eye as she slowly regained her strength. He saw the way she tested her limbs, the subtle, pained winces she tried to hide. He saw the sharpness of her gaze as she tracked his every movement, her body always angled toward the door, ready for flight or fight. One afternoon he returned from feeding the livestock in the barn to find her standing. She was unsteady, using the wall for support, but she was on her feet. Her black clothes, which he had washed and mended, hung loosely on her thinned frame. Her gun belt was on the cot, the Colt returned to its holster. He had cleaned it for her, an act of trust he hadn't fully understood himself. He simply knew that a weapon like that was a part of her, and to leave it untended felt like a violation. She saw him notice, and a flicker of something, defiance, perhaps gratitude, crossed her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now, "for the gun." "It's yours," he replied simply, hanging his snow-covered coat by the door. "A tool should be cared for." Their conversations were like that, sparse, practical, yet freighted with unspoken meaning. One evening, as the fire danced and threw long shadows across the room, he found her staring into the flames, her expression lost and distant. He placed a mug of hot tea beside her. She looked at him, her guard lowered for just a second, and he saw the deep well of pain behind her eyes. "He said my name," she murmured, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. "The man who left me there. He said my name as if it were a curse." Reese said nothing, but he sat in the chair opposite her, a silent, solid presence in the warm dark. He was sharing her vigil, standing guard over her memories. In that shared silence, a thread of connection was spun, delicate but strong, a bond forged in the heart of a merciless winter. The thaw between them came as slowly as the distant promise of spring. It began when Lynn started to move around the cabin, her steps growing steadier each day. She would watch him work, her analytical gaze taking in the efficient, practiced way he split wood or repaired a latch. She was a woman who understood capability, and she recognized it in him. One morning she took the broom from its corner and began to sweep the floor, a simple domestic act that felt monumental. It was an offering, a way of claiming a small piece of this space, of contributing something other than her wounded silence. Reese watched her, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He found himself talking to her, filling the quiet with stories of the valley, of the stubbornness of his cattle, of the way the light changed on the mountain peaks. He never asked about her past, about the man who had hurt her, but he told her about his. He spoke of his wife, Anna, and their son, taken by fever in a single brutal week 5 years ago. This cabin, It was supposed to be our future, he said one evening, his voice thick with memory. After they were gone, it just became a place to hide. Lynn listened, her dark eyes holding his, offering a silent empathy that was more comforting than any words could be. She understood hiding. She understood ghosts. In return, she offered him a piece of her own story, a carefully chosen fragment. My father was a merchant in a city far from here, she said, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. He taught me that the only person you can ever truly rely on is yourself. He was wrong. The bitterness in her voice was a raw, open wound. It was after that confession that Martha arrived. She came on a snow-dusted horse, a hardy woman with eyes that had seen 70 winters and missed nothing. She brought a basket of dried apples, cured meat, and a new batch of her herbal remedies. She took in the sight of Lynn, her sharp gaze lingering on the healing bruises and the formidable gun belt, and then she looked at Reese. She saw the change in him, the subtle easing of the tension he'd carried for 5 years. "Well now," Martha said, her voice warm and raspy as she accepted a cup of coffee. "Looks like the mountain finally sent you some company, Reese." She spoke to Lynn with an easy, disarming respect, asking about her recovery, her calm demeanor inviting a trust that Lynn, to her own surprise, felt compelled to give. When Martha left, she pulled Reese aside at the door. "That one's a fighter," she whispered, nodding toward Lynn. "But even the toughest steel needs a safe forge. Don't you go letting that fire go out." The tentative peace of the cabin was shattered during Reese's next trip to the small trading post miles down the valley, a journey he made only when supplies ran dangerously low. The air in the store was thick with wood smoke and gossip. He kept his head down, gathering his goods, but he couldn't ignore the conversation brewing by the pot-bellied stove. A man named Corbin was in the territory, a charismatic man with cold eyes and a silver-tongued charm, leading a posse of hired guns. They were sweeping through the mining camps and homesteads, looking for a woman. A Chinese woman, the storekeeper said, who had stolen something valuable from him. "Says she betrayed him," one of the trappers added, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the sawdust. "He's offering a reward, a big one." Reese's blood ran cold. He paid for his flour and salt, his face an impassive mask, but his mind was racing. He hurried home, the mountains that had once seemed like protectors, now feeling like the walls of a trap. He found Lynn in the barn, her movements fluid and precise as she groomed his horse. The quiet competence of the scene was a stark contrast to the ugly news he carried. He didn't know how to tell her, but he didn't have to. When he walked in, she took one look at his face, and she knew. The color drained from hers, and the coiled watchfulness returned, sharper and more dangerous than ever. "He's here," she stated, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. It wasn't a question. Reese could only nod. That night, the full weight of the winter seemed to press down on the small cabin. A fierce wind screamed around the eaves, rattling the shutters. Lynn didn't sleep. She sat by the dying fire, her Colt resting on her lap, her body rigid with a terrible stillness. Reese lay on his bedroll, feigning sleep, watching her. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hour of the night, a sound escaped her. A choked, desperate sob she tried to smother. He was beside her in an instant, not touching, but just being there. She flinched, her hand tightening on her weapon. "It's just me," he said softly. "You're safe here, Lynn." She looked up at him, her face a mask of anguish in the dim firelight. "There is no safe place," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He will never stop." He knelt before her then and reached out, not for her, but for the cold steel of the gun in her lap. He gently wrapped his hand around hers. "Then we will stop him." The threat of Corbin's arrival transformed the cabin from a shelter into a fortress. The unspoken bond between them solidified into a silent, functioning partnership. There was no need for grand strategies or long discussions. They moved with a shared instinct for survival. While Reese secured the doors and windows, reinforcing them with heavy timbers, Lynn took stock of their arsenal. She laid out his rifle and her own pistols on the main table, her hands moving with an unnerving familiarity as she checked each mechanism, her focus absolute. He watched her, not with the awe of a man seeing a woman handle a weapon, but with the deep respect of one survivor for another. Her skill was not a performance. It was a testament to the life she had been forced to live. She was not a fragile thing to be protected. She was a warrior, and he was proud to stand beside her. The days leading up to the inevitable confrontation were fraught with a strange, heightened intimacy. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the swirling snow outside, and the space between them. They worked together, their movements synchronized, their silences filled with a profound understanding. One afternoon, as the light began to fail, she was cleaning her Colts by the firelight, the metallic clicks echoing in the quiet room. Reese sat across from her, carefully loading cartridges. He noticed a small, intricate dragon engraved near the handle of her pistol, almost worn smooth with time. "It was my mother's," she said, following his gaze. Her voice was soft, stripped of its usual defenses. "She told me it would protect me. She said a dragon's heart is fire, and it can never be extinguished." He looked from the engraving to her face, illuminated by the warm glow of the flames. He saw the fire in her eyes, the unquenchable spirit that Corbin had tried and failed to beat out of her. "She was right," he said, his voice low and certain. In that moment, the last of his own walls crumbled. The fear he had harbored for years, the fear of loving and losing again, seemed insignificant next to the fierce, desperate need to keep this woman safe, to keep that fire in her heart burning bright. He didn't say the words. He didn't have to. She saw it in his eyes, in the gentle way he looked at her, and for the first time since she'd been dragged from a life of calculated survival, Lynn felt the terrifying, unfamiliar flicker of hope. The blizzard hit with the force of a physical blow, a maelstrom of wind and blinding snow that erased the world. It was under the cover of this chaos that they came. Reese saw them first, 5 dark shapes materializing through the swirling white, their horses struggling against the gale. There was no time for words. He and Lynn exchanged a single, hard look of understanding. He grabbed his rifle from its rack above the mantel, while she strapped on her gun belt, the familiar weight a cold comfort. The calm that settled over her was absolute. This was her element, the violent world she knew how to navigate. The first knock on the door was deceptively polite. "Hello in the house," a voice called, laced with a false, charming warmth that made the hair on Reese's arms stand on end. It was Corbin. Reese moved to the side of the door, his rifle ready. Lynn took up a position near the window, a pistol in each hand, her body a study in deadly stillness. "We're just looking for shelter from the storm," Corbin called again, "and for something that belongs to me." The lie hung in the air, thin and pathetic. Without warning, the door exploded inward, splintering off its hinges. The storm screamed into the room, bringing with it a flurry of snow and the dark figures of Corbin's men. The first man through the door was met not by a frightened homesteader, but by the deafening roar of Reese's rifle. The fight was a whirlwind of violent motion and thunderous noise. It was close, brutal, and fought in the flickering firelight and swirling snow. Reese was not a gunslinger, but he was a strong man defending his home, and he fought with the ferocity of a cornered bear, using the heavy rifle as both a firearm and a club. But it was Lynn who moved like a phantom in the chaos. She was a blur of black cloth and controlled fury, her pistols barking, each shot precise, economical, and final. She moved with a dancer's grace and a predator's instinct, her face a mask of cold concentration. 2 more men fell to her guns before they even knew where she was. the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the shouts of dying men. It was over in seconds. The sudden, ringing silence was broken only by the howling of the wind and the ragged sound of their breathing. 4 men lay dead, and in the ruined doorway, silhouetted against the raging storm, stood Corbin, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face as his eyes locked onto Lynn. "There you are, my lovely Lynn," Corbin said, his voice smooth as polished stone, cutting through the wind. He stepped over the body of one of his men, his movements unhurried, his expensive coat barely dusted with snow. He ignored Reese completely, his entire focus a possessive, burning brand on her. "I have to admit, you are far more trouble than you are worth, but a man must adhere to his principles." Lynn raised her pistol, her arm steady, her aim true. "You have no principles," she bit out, her voice dripping with contempt. "Only appetites." Corbin's smile widened. "And you, my dear, were my finest. So loyal. Until you grew a conscience." He took another step into the room, his hand moving slowly toward the ivory-handled revolver at his hip. "That little ledger you took, it was very foolish. Did you really think you could stop me?" "I'm not trying to stop you," Lynn said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I'm going to erase you." It happened in a flash. Corbin drew his weapon with blinding speed, but Lynn was faster. She had been living with this moment in her mind for months. Her shot was not a reaction, it was an inevitability. The bullet struck him center mass. A look of genuine surprise crossed his handsome face, before his eyes glazed over and he crumpled to the floor. The silence that followed was absolute. The storm outside seemed to hold its breath. Lynn stood frozen, the pistol still extended, smoke curling from the barrel. Then, a low groan from the corner of the room shattered the stillness. Reese. He was slumped against the wall, his hand pressed to his side, blood seeping between his fingers. A stray bullet had found him in the chaos. Lynn was across the room in an instant, dropping to her knees beside him. The cold fury on her face was replaced by a raw, naked fear. "Reese," she breathed, her hands hovering over the wound, afraid to touch, afraid to hurt him more. He looked up at her, his face pale but his eyes clear. "You see," he rasped, a faint, pained smile touching his lips. "Told you we'd stop him." She tore a strip from her shirt, her movements deft and sure as she pressed it against the wound. Her hands were shaking. All her life she had fought for herself. Now the thought of losing this quiet, gentle man was a pain far sharper than any Corbin had ever inflicted. "Don't you dare," she whispered fiercely, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Don't you dare leave me. I just found you." He reached up, his hand covering hers, his touch surprisingly strong. "I'm not going anywhere," he vowed, his gaze holding hers. "I'm not going anywhere." In the storm's aftermath, a profound quiet descended upon the valley. The world outside was buried under a thick, clean blanket of white, the sky a bruised purple in the fading light. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft murmur of Lynn's voice as she tended to Reese's wound. The bullet had gone clean through his side, a painful but not fatal injury. She cleaned and stitched the wound with a surgeon's precision, her skills another remnant of a life she never spoke of. Her touch was firm, yet incredibly gentle. The roles had been completely reversed. She was now the caretaker, the guardian, and he was the one who was vulnerable. As she worked, she felt the last of her own icy defenses melting away, washed clean by the fierce protective love that had bloomed in the face of death. Once he was bandaged and resting, propped up with pillows on his cot, she finally allowed herself to sit. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind an exhaustion that was bone deep. She looked around the room, at the splintered door and the dark stains on the floorboards that she would have to scrub away. She looked at the still forms of the men she had killed, Men who were once her companions in a life she despised. It was all part of a past that had finally, violently, been laid to rest. Reese watched her, his expression soft. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice quiet. She shook her head, pulling a chair close to his cot. "I'm not leaving your side." They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, the firelight playing over their faces. They had faced the ghosts of her past together, and they had won. What lay before them was an unknown country, a future they had not dared to imagine. Martha arrived the next day, as if summoned by some unseen force. She took in the scene, the patched-up door, the scrubbed floors, Reese pale but alive in his bed, and Lynn, weary but resolute, sitting guard beside him, and she simply nodded. She brought a potent broth and stronger bandages, her presence a calm, reassuring anchor. She helped Lynn drag the bodies out to the barn for temporary burial until the ground thawed. As they worked, the old woman looked at Lynn. "He's a good man, Reese," she said. "He just forgot how to live. Looks like you reminded him." Lynn looked toward the cabin where the lamp cast a warm, golden glow from the window. "I think," she said softly, "we reminded each other." Months passed. The deep snows of winter slowly receded, surrendering their grip on the valley. The mountains, once stark and white, began to show the dark, solid granite beneath, their peaks catching the golden light of longer days. The oppressive silence of the cold was replaced by the sound of dripping icicles, the rush of melting streams, and the tentative chirps of returning birds. Spring arrived not as a sudden event, but as a slow, gentle unfurling of life. Green shoots pushed their way through the damp earth, and the aspens on the hillsides began to bud, a faint, hazy green against the blue sky. The transformation outside was mirrored within the walls of the cabin. The scars of their battle, both physical and emotional, began to fade. Reese's wound healed, leaving a pale line on his side that he would always carry. Lynn's nightmares of Corbin's voice in the frozen wasteland grew less frequent, replaced by dreams of a warm hearth and a quiet, steady presence beside her. They worked side by side, rebuilding the broken door, mending the fences, preparing the land for planting. They moved in an easy rhythm, a partnership forged in violence and tempered by peace. The protector and the protected had vanished, leaving only two equals, two survivors who had found in each other a reason to build rather than just endure. He taught her the names of the wildflowers that bloomed in the meadow. She showed him how to read the clouds, predicting the weather with an accuracy that amazed him. They discovered a quiet joy in these small, shared moments. The trauma of their past had not disappeared, but it no longer defined them. It was a part of their story, the dark, rich soil from which something new and beautiful was now growing. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink, they stood on the small porch of the cabin, looking out at the valley. The air was cool and clean, filled with the scent of damp earth and new life. Reese reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It was a simple gesture, but it held the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Lynn leaned her head against his shoulder, her body relaxing into his in a way that spoke of absolute trust, of coming home. The dragon on her pistol was a reminder of the fire within her, but she no longer needed it for protection. That fire now served to warm their shared life. "It's beautiful," she whispered, gazing at the majestic, permanent peaks of the mountains. "Yes," Reese agreed, though he was not looking at the mountains. He was looking at her. "It is." The future was no longer a threat to be survived, but a promise waiting to be kept, together.